Hello, greetings, and welcome. We are so happy to be here today for the Distinguished Artist Series with Jaydan Moore, presented by the James Romick Alliance for Craft. I'm Jamie Ann Jacobin, the Executive Director. And if you're new to the Alliance, we are a nonprofit based out of Washington, D.C. that focuses on the education, connoisseurship, and public appreciation of American craft art. So you'll hear us say craft a lot. We are lovers of all the mediums and all of the new explorations in the field. The Distinguished Artists Series, which you are here for today, is one of the longest running craft artist series in the country. So I'm going to have Rebecca Ravenel, our board president and chair of the Distinguished Artist Series, talk a little bit more about this beloved series and our featured artist, Jaydan Moore. Rebecca?
Jamie Ann. So I'm Rebecca Ravenel. I am the chair of the Distinguished Artist Series. For that series, 4 times each year, we invite a notable craft artist to give a virtual talk and an in-person demonstration. We're very delighted to have metal artist Jaydan Moore be our first presenter of 2024 in this series. We do have 2 more artists in the coming months. So if you like the series, please go to our website and check out information on those events too. Jaydan Moore has spent a lot of time thinking about all the stuff that we accumulate in a lifetime. As he'll elaborate, his family business gave him ample opportunity to reflect on the value and meaning of objects. Throughout art school and further work in jewelry and metal businesses, Jaydan found ways to express his thoughts about people's attachments to items that play a role from prosaic to profound in our lives. Jaydan's work has gained the attention of many publications, collectors, and institutions. He's won top grants and awards and held residencies at prominent craft institutions. Currently, he is making work as a full-time studio artist in Richmond, Virginia. We're so happy that Jaydan could make room for us in his very busy schedule to deliver this artist talk today and to travel to DC this weekend for an in-person demonstration. Welcome, Jaydan.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you all for coming and being here for this talk. I'm really, really excited. I was just telling Jamie and Rebecca and Inga that I just finished a piece, and it was really nice to kind of have this as kind of a culmination of that kind of major push of a deadline. So first off, I want to say thank you to Jamie and Rebecca and Inga for all that they did to put this together and to have me come up on Saturday. I'm really, really excited about we're going to go see a whole lot of different things and for my demonstration and to meet some of you all who maybe are on this call. Today I want to share with you guys kind of my major body of work for the last, I cannot quite believe it, 12, almost 13 years that I've been working in silver-plated platters. So how I kind of structured this this kind of lecture is I'm going to kind of talk about some of the ideas that have kind of pushed me into using silver plate and kind of the concepts that I kind of imbue or try to imbue onto my objects. I start with that first so that then I can then talk about kind of how I've evolved those ideas over into kind of multiple different kind of iterations or thoughts that come into making some of the pieces. My title for this lecture is There. I like these 2 words because I feel like they've always been a bit of a challenge for me to kind of delineate between kind of the possession of there and the kind of place of there. And so I'm going to kind of quickly go over why I've had such a difficult time with those things. And maybe difficult's not the right word, that I think that they kind of mix for me, and I like to have that kind of idea evolve between the 2. So Rebecca kind of briefly touched on it for a second, but my family's been in the tombstone business for over 4 generations, over 100 years. My mom is maybe on this call, but also is probably starting her workday at this very moment, at this place that you see at the top. So from a young age, our finality on this planet has always been kind of in the purview. When I was a kid, this is where I would spend the rest of my after school. I would hang out here and listen to loved ones make accommodations for the people they've lost. And what I would say is there's this kind of possession of their possession of kind of all of this life being distilled into these monuments, and that then they are then a place, right? There's a place to go to then honor and respect for those people. Lastly, I want to say that my family also had a storage facility just behind this building. So part of my childhood was also kind of rummaging through some of these storage facilities, probably not supposed to, but got to kind of look at this kind of culmination of other objects that people lived with or wanted to keep, but then maybe didn't have at their home, and how there's kind of this consumers culture where we have all of these keepsakes that we can't kind of fully hold, like that imbue so much value, but then there's so much that we almost don't even can't even keep them in our house. So I also really love this notion that my family was, in this industry, but they were also an artist in some capacity too. They were kind of distilling these kind of small little pieces of information of a person down to kind of a name, a date, a passage, and then kind of some imagery or photos of them too that they really loved. So this is me as a kid sitting in as for a kind of a mock-up for a veteran society monument that then my family created. And so I bring that up because this is kind of where my body of work begins, is in grad school, I kind of lean towards what is the kind of best object that denotes an object that is a monument or a marker in metal, and that is the trophy. And the trophy history is kind of an amazing one. We see them as mostly competitive objects, but they all started off as altruistic gifts. They were gifts for retirement. They were gifts for finishing or completing a major thing in your career, that kind of thing. And so most of them, the altruistic gifts, were table serviceware. They were objects that you would now have time to sit around the table and relax after retiring, and you should get to enjoy your tea set or your punch bowl. And so maybe many of us know the Stanley Cup, and the Stanley Cup, begins with this image on the left, this kind of punch bowl, and then over time it has been all evolved into the image that we know it today. But I think that there's this amazing narrative in kind of how this object has slowly been altered and edited to kind of think about what that the hockey federation means to our society. And I wouldn't say that we get to do this with the objects that we live with. We aren't putting plinths onto our cups that we love, but I do think we do this with memory, that what we do is we kind of can slowly keep imbuing value onto these things that we sit with every single day and care for. So I started making kind of these trophies out of table serviceware. And I like to show these two, just a couple samplings of them. But what I was trying to do is kind of recreate some of that imagery or iconography out of just secondhand shop material stuff that is being kind of cast off. And this is where I find the silver-plated platter. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in a little bit later on then how I then kind of make that fully my material of choice. So the second there is the place there. And I like to show this image that when I was a kid, I just kind of fell in love with this location. We used to drive by it, going to my grandparents' house, coming to and from my grandparents' house. Because I'd never seen circle hay bales in my life. I'm from California. And I know that's kind of a nonsense piece of information, but I just thought it was kind of amazing. And so I would always pass by it and kind of be curious about this kind of location, this farm. And my dad used to always say, and I know he's on the call, he would always say that this is going to turn into houses one day. And And I knew he was right, but I didn't understand how he could kind of witness the future, you know? And so I think it was interesting that I kind of would sit there, and every single time we'd pass by, I'd be like, has it changed? Has it changed? And he was close, you know, it's my least favorite photo in my talk, but you know, it became a strip mall, you know, and what I find interesting about this is, so it's location, but the possession of that memory of what that once was. That for some people who are just moving to this place, it's always going to be this. But for me, I have the possession of those hay bales being there, and that's still meaning so much to me, that see that evolution. And so I talk about this because I think there's this kind of mix or juxtaposition of kind of what are those kind of possessions of quintessential images of our culture. And that's where table serviceware for me has been such a paramount piece. So for me, these two images are kind of how I'm always trying to kind of culminate these two things, or see how they all kind of speak to one another. So with the Met Museum of Art on the left, I would say this is the quintessential image of like what we think of table serviceware, that this is kind of the pinnacle. But then on the right, this is what most of us live with and cast off and reconstitute, and that these things are lived with at the same time. And I think that these two things actually communally evolve and affect one another as they are kind of used and or seen. And so the silver-plated platter to me has three different values that I just find so kind of paramount to our culture. And so the first is this kind of layer of silver, right? That these objects are mass produced, and so they're not going to make them all out of sterling. And so we're just imbuing a very thin layer of silver onto the object. We're not even really, I mean, just a file or a piece of sandpaper will knock it off completely. But we all wanted to have this kind of notion of that kind of silver object that we get to then bring out for tea service. The second is the imagery, kind of all of these objects were stamped, and so they're kind of relating to the hand engraving objects of kind of the 17th and 18th century. And I think that's so interesting too, that like we can't get away from this imagery. We still find it beautiful and infatuating, and it still plays a major part in what kind of objects or imagery we find beautiful in present day. And then the final image, kind of imbuing of value, is the wear, or lack thereof. You know, like how are people caring for these things, and what are they kind of adding with memory onto their objects? So this is the only platter I've never broken or cut up, because I just think it's so beautiful that somebody cleaned this thing so much and cared for it so much that it is actually knocking the plating off, and kind of you're just seeing the copper that's underneath it. So in grad school, I kind of began wanting to kind of create a communal image of kind of tableware in our society. And so I started kind of with this kind of idea of like almost stained glass, you know, or kind of shards of all of these little pieces that are kind of being sent to the secondhand shop to kind of be either used or recycled. And what does it look like when you get to kind of piece those all together into one accumulated piece? At that time, I thought 3 feet by 2 feet was so big. And we're going to talk more about how that has kind of grown over time too. And so just to give you guys an idea of how I put these things together, most of my work is a bee tank, a jeweler saw, and a lot of time. And so I use a low temp solder. I don't high temp most of my material. Sorry, my cat has now decided to get off my lap. I use a low temp solder for two reasons. One, that patina, that wear and care, I want to try to hold on to as much as possible. And if I were to get it up to a higher temp soldering, it would burn off completely. And then the last is, I hope my cursor will show up, is this kind of decorative edge down here at the bottom right is pot metal. And so if I were to get it up to a higher temperature, this would kind of melt completely off. So it is pretty close to almost like a stained glass style of making until I get to the marrying of metal. And not to be left out, I didn't want it to just be about the platters. I wanted to kind of talk about some of the other objects, the tea sets and things like that, and how we also do this kind of idea of imbuing memory onto them and kind of then trying to make that into kind of think about that idea and bring it to an imagery or a material kind of creation. So, this bottom piece is the teapot, but then I'm kind of thinking about how I can show that kind of accumulation of value and care over time to it almost being a trophy-esque kind of object. It's a little detail of kind of how this marrying of metal happens. I'm going to show another example to kind of describe that a little further. This then kind of comes into thinking about platters as an object that also has a place on the table and how it can move and kind of create kind of a shape or form as it is passed around, and how the ideas and memories that we add to this object can be much more than the actual space of the object itself, that it can be so much more meaningful than kind of one object can hold on to. So when I first started out, I was kind of very interested in this material, but I would say that most of my research for the first year or two was just kind of material presence, like what is this object, collecting this stuff as fast as I can. So I was buying it mostly from secondhand shops, but then I bought out all of the secondhand shops, so I had to move to further circumference. And so what I found really amazing is I knew this stuff was mass produced, but I didn't know it to the extent, right? And so I start being able to see multiples of the same object. And so then you get to see that layer of wear and care for each individual and how those can then relate to one another, or kind of the differences of the two. So I made this body of work kind of another iteration of this major body of work where I was kind of putting those pieces together to show those kind of changes, that it's almost like an organism, that these objects look exactly the same as they come off the production floor, but then how they then go out into the world and are cared for shows how nuanced they then become. And I like to think about that as kind of how we all are, right? We all have these kind of rituals that we all do every single day that are very similar, but then we have all of our nuances of how they relate to our daily lives. So this is kind of what the pieces look like before I solder them. I do this process of marrying of metal. And so marrying of metal is cutting a piece of metal perfectly out of another and trying to then solder it in and make it look completely flush. Low temp solder definitely helps kind of fill those gaps. But what I'm doing is I'm kind of just cutting these pieces back and forth on one another, deciding what I want to keep and not keep, and then piecing them back together like a jigsaw puzzle, and then soldering them. So I kind of call this collection the specimen series, thinking about them as little organisms, kind of either kind of slowly detaching from one another to go off into their own separate lives, using utensils as well, kind of thinking about how those kind of relate as kind of similar aesthetic objects that then are kind of making formal imagery on the table. And what's great is then I get to know a little bit more about where these objects come from. So most of my pieces that I get are from eBay at this point. I have probably the most silver-plated eBay purchases of anybody in the world. But then I get to also come upon them from other places. So this is one platter from eBay, and then the other one I found at a junkyard in Asheville, North Carolina, that had been run over by a truck. And so kind of one object still being perfectly polished and being cared for, the other already at the recycling center, ready to be kind of retrofitted or recreated into something new. Another example So while I'm doing this, I'm seeing so many of the same kind of object. And one kind of little memory of my childhood popped back into my brain that my job when I was a little kid was to kind of take rubbings of the tombstone, so that if my family had somebody interested in a similar monument, they could just kind of rub it to kind of get a kind of sense of what they wanted to do, so that they could then kind of redesign it with the names and other ideas that the family wanted. And so I kind of wanted to take a marker of some of these objects as I was kind of breaking them down, and make them and kind of see that final layer of value, that kind of shift from this object living with somebody and meaning something for someone, for that family, and then them deciding they don't need that in their world anymore. And so kind of that kind of passing to then me recreating it into something else. So what I do is I kind of take these plates and ink them like an intaglio print, which is carding ink onto the surface into those kind of press molded, stamped lines, and then cleaning the top of the surface and then printing them onto paper. Thankfully, I've had a lot of friends who'd be super helpful in kind of me getting better at this as I've gone along. And so what I love about this is that you then get to see the kind of some of these nuances, and the things that we do, we've been doing since we were a kid, we still do as an adult. So I love that this is a print of this very regular, kind of well-known rectangle W.M. Rogers plate. But then the family has also added their little kind of family name onto it. And I think about that as a kid, that I used to kind of like to write my name as, this is mine, this is my object. And then you get to see how it's the same pattern, but also a women's society also decided that this was the way they wanted to imbue kind of the people who have achieved certain goals. I don't know what that is, but certain goals as the time passed, and that there's this, and again, constant similarity in how we live our lives. So I do a donation service that if anybody donates a platter to me, I will print it onto paper for you as a thank you, because you're kind of giving up an heirloom, and I want you to have something in return, a kind of a marker of what that looks like to you, and what that final shift was. So these are a few of the donations that I've received over the years. I have quite a backlog, and I need to get to some time to actually print them. And this, I bring this one up because I thought this was kind of just such an amazing kind of experience. This was one of the first plates I ever was donated to me. And so this is a handmade plate from India. And so I was so nervous, like every single time this happens, I'm always like, I just need to reiterate that I will be actively destroying it as a functional object and kind of creating it into this sheet of metal so that then I can print it onto paper. And thankfully the person was so kind and generous and was like, yeah, I'm ready for you to give it a shot. And so I usually print front and back. So you get to see the decorative imagery, but then you also get the company name. And I thought this was so great because the back right has kind of these center punch marks to show kind of how the imagery was built on the front. And here is a large collection of them that I had at a solo show, kind of to show kind of every one of the kind of donations that have come through my door. And that has all of these ideas, I feel like kind of slowly kind of then evolve back into different kind of things that then affect another notion of print or metal. And so this is kind of the culmination of that kind of printing series that then turns into some of the metal objects that we're going to see in a second. So I had been cutting all these platters out, and I wanted to actually also kind of evolve some of my ideas onto them, not let them just be records, which I love, but I wanted them also to be kind of add my own touch to them. So this is a lattice series collection. I did a set of 7. And so the top left image is my first print. So I was kind of thinking about some of the imagery that is on the platters that I get to see super up close day to day. But then I was thinking about how that imagery can then be layered with meaning so often and so much that then it becomes noise, or something that we don't even really think about kind of what where that imagery came from. So what I did was I slowly just kept marrying material in and reprinting until you almost can't even see the lattice anymore. I've also done this kind of in a backwards approach. I'm a stickler. Some would call it hoarding, but I'm also a stickler for trying to keep a collection of material that I wonder if I can kind of just use in one specific object to then see how one culmination of a part of the platter can then become something. So these are all of the flowers from the scraps on my floor from my graduate show. And so I had them for a really long time. And I was like, I think a wreath would be really lovely as kind of an image of all of that stuff being put together. And so this piece, People Forget Years and Remember Moments, is you can't fully see it. You can kind of see it in the bottom right, is as the wreath is kind of slowly disappearing, the embossing of the plate is also on the object too. So you get to see the negative, the kind of the loss of that memory or relevancy. And so I've had the great experience of getting to then see some of this kind of conversation that I've been having over the last kind of during this lecture of how these two things relate, like how does this material that is kind of an imagery or a recontextualization of the 17th centuries and the 18th centuries, how then that then gets recontextualized into this object, and then how my object then gets related into current society. And so I've got to have I've had a few of my pieces in kind of major collections on view to kind of show them in context with some of the objects that they relate to. So this is the MFA Boston. It was on view. I think it's still on view for a few more months in their kind of English wing. And this is a historical society. It's the Bayou Bend collection, that's affiliated with the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. And so they were generous enough to new fresh artists just ask the question, could I ever take photos of my pieces in your collection to see what that would look like? And so one of the pieces we've already spoke about is back here in the back right next to the mirror. And then another piece we're going to talk about shortly is in the piece in the front, right in between the candelabras. Another little image. And how what I'm hoping to do is see how these two things can then kind of re-speak to one another, and how these little notions of all of these objects can affect the overall idea of what this material means to us, and how I think is really interesting that this material or the objects that are in the space, these historical societies, are in their perfect form, that kind of an artifact of what that moment in time meant to us. What was the imagery? What was the kind of context of that space? But we can never really put ourselves back in that because we have so much of our own culture within us. But I can make an object that has our cultural context that is imbued with that material, with the imagery from that time, but I can't also get us back there at the full state. Another image of that piece in the middle. And so many of my pieces, I try to kind of thread the line of artifact, object that maybe has kind of fallen apart or is still being rebuilt. Many of our objects are kind of communally always kind of being altered with their value, and that could be adding value and meaning, and kind of the value in our culture can kind of slowly be growing, or it could be being lost as we kind of find that it doesn't mean as much as it once did in our society. And how that little kind of play, I think, is really amazing, that we're all kind of adding our little individual ideas of an object into the communal image of that piece. Like I was saying before, I kind of try to collect as much of a particular material as possible. And then with that, I try to then use that to then think about how maybe one material can then speak to how we imbue or focus on time. So for example, this is a piece called Ends. And so what I did was I kept all of those pot metal rims I had spoken about earlier, kind of this decorative edge that I think can be such a nice like spot for your eye to sit on when you're looking at the platters. And I collected those all up to kind of see what I could do with it. And I was like, it's almost like little timeline markers, like each one of these pieces that I had cut out. And I was thinking about how, time is, I believe it's Mark Twain that said, time doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so I was thinking about that as kind of the communal circling of kind of this idea of material being reused over and over and over again, and recontextualizing it. So for some reason, kind of the movement of putting a hose back on kind of the hanger really came into my purview. That doing that action, you're trying to do it perfectly, make it all fit perfectly together, but that nuance is never going to be right. And so it's one continuous loop, this ends piece, that then is kind of slowly folding out and then kind of coming back in on itself. Another version of this is all of the rims from kind of not pot metal rims, but another notion, and trying to kind of create form and structure from it. And then I talked a little bit about kind of that print series where I'm adding and subtracting. And so not to, again, miss out on using material scraps that are on the floor. I also kind of made this kind of tablecloth that is all of the leftover remnants from building that piece. So it's kind of this formal structure that is the exact same size as the prints that I was making, the print paper that I was using, into this kind of folded piece of cloth that is kind of waving in the wind. I showed that first platter at the beginning, and over time, I kind of wanted to recreate some of those ideas and bring them back to kind of this kind of cultural image of the platter. And that kind of accumulation of this object and how the function of these objects is kind of slowly becoming obsolete. It's not a part of our culture anymore, that many of us don't live with this object as a tea service. And so I started to think of them as kind of, artifacts, and almost like tapestry, that they're kind of hanging on the wall for many of us as kind of an imagery, an image of kind of an aesthetic that we really love. But then even that is starting to kind of fall to pieces. So many of the platters that I've made over the last 7 years has this kind of falling to pieces kind of collection building as I go further and further and bigger and bigger. And so with these pieces, I'm usually kind of thinking, with the first couple, I'm thinking about table size, like what is that kind of the scale, the kind of shape of a table that we kind of live with, but then kind of slowly coming back after I've built the piece and tattering the material to kind of look like it's kind of moths are getting to it, that those memories are kind of falling out of it as I keep working with it. This is a little bit of an offshoot, but I was asked to be in a table show a few years ago, and I was thinking a lot about kind of, again, that idea of the monument, like what are those objects in our world that are monuments to all of us. And I started thinking about the table leaf, that the table leaf is this kind of monumental object that comes out specifically for times where we are coming together with family or friends, holidays, birthdays, those the kind of things. And then it's this object that kind of just disappears and lives, the one that I'm thinking of, lives underneath the spare bedroom for many, many days, and then comes out. But every time it does come out is a moment that you're going to always kind of remember. So I made a table leaf out of the silver plated platters to kind of imbue that with its kind of commemorative moment, its commemorative kind of placement of that piece. So as I've gone further and further with this material, I always kind of joke that when I was starting off, I thought, what would be an amazing idea is if sorry, my cat has decided to come in. This material, I always thought that this material would kind of slowly, I would kind of burn out of it, that I thought that that would be a nice final finishing of this body of work, was that at some point I would use up all the material on eBay, and then I could kind of create, I'd move on to another body of work. But I can tell you right now that I have not even remotely scratched the surface, that as I've worked in this material, eBay has just gotten more and more pieces. And so it has further grown into, I see how this material has further enveloped our kind of culture. And so I've been kind of making these larger pieces that kind of discuss almost the object as, again, that kind of organism, that kind of little pieces that are kind of going out into our culture of ever more and ever more. This is the kind of tide for the largest piece I've ever made. So this is 25 feet by 8 feet in its surface area, and kind of thinking about how then can I build that size of an object, not in one single layer, but then how I can kind of think about them as regions, or kind of how they bleed out into their different worlds. I've also kind of started to think about them more as sheets, like I showed that traces image, and I started to want to think about only that little spot in the platter that we all kind of look at and stare at with all of their kind of patterning. And so this is all made of metal, 6 feet in diameter. Yeah, and how then it kind of just becomes this little, like almost leaves falling onto this kind of sheet of metal. In the last year or so, I've also been kind of playing a little bit more with form with these platters. So again, kind of tattering the bottom, but then kind of forming and kind of creating structure with the bottom shapes. This is my newest piece. This was actually just finished on Friday, and so I was thinking about how tablecloth is also another kind of monumental object that we kind of use and abuse as we kind of eat around the table. And so I was thinking about how that object can be then folded up, and kind of how that kind of rebringing out can start to break apart this kind of object over time. And so this is kind of these large whole structures that are kind of starting to almost make this piece just impossible to be together. So I wanted to, this is a new way of me kind of talking about this kind of this lecture. So this is one of the last pieces of my graduate show, but I wanted to talk about it at this set time because I feel like it's kind of imbued some of the things I've been working on lately. And so this is a piece that I did kind of thinking about one specific part of the teapots that I just kind of found so beautiful, which was the interior. That so much of, as you steep tea or put hot water into the teapot, you get this kind of raising of the fine silver within the middle, right? It's completely white and kind of beautiful on the inside. And so I wanted to kind of put that on display. And so I kind of cut them all open like oranges and kind of splayed them out to kind of create this overall shape. And so what I did at the end was I kind of added decking to the interior to kind of make this completely full and kind of watertight. So each piece is being cut to fit that form structure of the teapot. And so this piece was finished about a month ago, and I bring this piece in now because I think I've really been thinking about how we use material, how we alter and affect material in the kind of craft objects and kind of craft making that we do, and how that can relate to memory. So this is kind of thinking about carving away at a kind of a big block of material to then get down to that kind of structure that's within it that we want to make functional, or a piece that we love or want to kind of be a part of our everyday life. So this is almost the same idea, where I'm actually taking the teapots and cutting them up and then kind of faceting them together to then make this kind of structural object. So this piece is about 3 feet by 3 feet. And so you get to kind of see the interior, kind of this kind of basket shape. And then you have this kind of pot metal rim as kind of that final decorative edge. All right, so now we're going to kind of hit upon the last few things in the last couple of years. So with the last chunk of time, I've really been kind of wanting to stretch away from just the platter as a communal object, but also really think about it almost as a material. I've been with this material for 12 years, and the ecological impact of it in our society is, I've seen just how much it's a part of our lives, but I also think it's really amazing that I have not used a new piece of metal. I've actually sometimes bought this material for even cheaper than you can for a fresh piece of copper on some of the metal companies around the country. And so I want to think about that kind of idea of these kind of fragmented objects, but then start to break this thing down almost into just sheets of metal that then can kind of recreate kind of these artifacts that we live with, or these imagery that was in the material itself that then kind of becomes aesthetics that we all live with. So this also, I'm kind of looking at wood carving again, kind of how we carve away at a piece of wood to then kind of create ornament and structure. So the last thing I want to kind of share is that this was kind of the major piece of the last year. I was asked I was commissioned to be a part of the National Gallery of Victoria's triennial. And so I was asked to kind of make something to the scale of the 25-foot platter that I showed before. And so this was the culmination of that piece. And what I really wanted to do was kind of take all of these ideas and kind of culminate them into this final kind of form of this tattered object, but how I also think about them as location and region and placement, and kind of how these have kind of gone out into our culture and kind of created their own societal structure in our lives. And so yeah, I'm pretty happy and pleased with this final shape and form, and happy to see it down in Australia. Thank you guys so much, and I look forward to hearing questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jaydan. I mean, the way you think about things and meld together all these interesting influences and reflections and perspectives, it feels like the intellectual equivalent of one of your assemblage pieces. So it's really satisfying to hear you pull all sorts of areas together to articulate your artistic practice. And
Thank
we're
you so
very
much.
excited for you to be here in town for the in-person demo. Unfortunately, I do think that workshop is full. But for those people in the area, that is just a reminder and a little nudge to go onto our website and see the other two remaining Distinguished Artist Series artists that we will have coming in the upcoming months. And if you're interested, you should sign up for that workshop soon, because they do actually fill up. Thank you everyone for attending. And we do have some great events. You can find information on our website, and please do consider becoming a member so you can keep abreast of those events. Thanks again, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Jayden.